walked into the ICU room in the middle of the day, one November, many years ago. The amber light was coming in, the November light, how lovely it is. It was coming in through that hospital window. And the nurses had kindly turned down the overhead fluorescent lights. And so I went in and I sat down and I saw my friend and my parishioner, Bob. It wasn't supposed to turn out this way. Bob went in to the doctor's office and had a physical, and they heard something in his heart, and then they decided they were going to take him into the hospital and do an angiogram and probably a stent, which is what they did. And after they had done the stent failed, and then through a number of other issues, he ended up having open heart surgery, and now here he was in his hospital bed in a coma. Bob is a remarkable person. He and I had had many conversations. He and his wife were always in church, so there was plenty of time to get to know him. He was in Bible study every time we had it. They were volunteering out in the community. And he told me about his years in Notre Dame. He was a professor at Notre Dame, and he was also the track coach out there. And he had led his team to several national championships. But not only that, Bob was an excellent runner, and he had set records back in the days of cinder tracks that held up all the way to the millennium. He was an amazing person, and I cherished knowing him. And then he was there in a coma. I quietly called out his name, Bob. I put my hand on his hand. Nothing. I sang to him gently, quietly in the room. I cupped my hand on the top of his head, gently, feeling the warmth of his head. Nothing. Then as I stood there, I began having my silent shouting match at God. As I stood there, I was shouting in my heart, "What are you doing? Where are you? Can't you get down here and help?" And this went on for a time. And while it went on, my tears were making little puddles on the top of his hand. And I eventually stopped and I looked for a clean towel in the room and I wiped his hand very carefully, making sure that it was completely dry. And then I wiped my face. And I left. And by then, it was night. In our scripture for today, we will find Jesus at an evening. Actually, it was the night before he died, and he is having a meal with his disciples. And he did something that absolutely astonished them. He got up from the table, took a towel, and washed their feet. So listen with me as I read to you this remarkable story that can only be found in the Gospel of John. And it is in the 13th chapter, starting with the first verse. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "Unless I wash you, you will have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but it is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. And for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and then returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." A week later from when I was standing there at Bob's bed, I went to visit him again. He was on a medical floor now, and when I walked in, he was sitting up and he was eating. And as soon as he saw me come into the room, he said, "Oh, good." He said, "I have something for you. It's right over there on the bedside table." So I went over, and it was like a little scrap of paper. It looked like it was half of a piece of paper that had been torn out of a spiral notebook, and it was a crayon drawing. So I came over, and I sat down right next to him, and I looked at it, and it was a drawing of a person who had blonde hair and a red heart. And also, there was plenty of light all in the drawing. There was all kinds of yellows surrounding that person. And the person in the drawing was smiling. And so I looked over at him, and he said, "It's you." I said, "Wow." And then he told me his story. It seems that while he was in a coma, he had had a dream. He had a dream that I came to his bed and that I had stood there praying for him. And when he woke up from his coma, he remembered that dream right away. And as soon as he remembered that dream, he had this rush of feeling. You see, Bob, even though he came to church every Sunday and all of those Bible studies and all that volunteering, I didn't know this, but he told me on that day when I visited him in the hospital, he says, "You know, I've never been able to believe in God." He said, "I've done everything I can think of. I've been reading the Bible my whole life. I've been coming to church, and I've been really trying, but I don't feel anything inside. I don't feel God, and I've never been able to convince myself there is a God." He said, "And so when I woke up and I remembered that dream, I felt God present in my heart, and I am completely sure now. I know there's a God. Oh, I'm so happy. I know there's a God." And you know, this wasn't the last time he told me this. He told me this over and over through the years that passed when I was still pastor at South Bend, just to let me know that that wonderful feeling that he had had was still with him, was as alive as it was that day he woke up. He was just so thrilled. And so I wasn't so convinced, however. I was the doubting one in the room. So I said, "How do you know it was me?" He looked at the drawing, and he looked at me, and he said, "The bangs, the bangs." I said, "Okay, all right." I didn't know what to say to him. But I did know that something had happened to him, and it was just so profoundly powerful. And he had been trying his whole life. He was now close to 80, and then he experienced God. Wow. Well, it's pretty hard to understand what the disciples might have been experiencing that night, the night before Jesus died, what they were thinking about God. My guess is they were pretty confused and a little bit upset. They were sitting at table with their Lord, their Master, and try to imagine the scene for just a moment. It probably didn't look like the picture that has been painted of the scene, because for one thing, the disciples would have been lying down and they would be supporting their heads with their elbows, and they reclined at the table. They didn't sit in chairs, and they would take the food, like the bread, and they would dip it into the sauces and things that were on the table. And of course, well, let's just say people didn't have utensils and napkins, so they're dipping it in, and you probably hear some smacking of their teeth, and they probably had to lick their fingers, and all that sort of thing was going on. Plus, there was a lot of conversation, because they were together for a meal, and you know how it is at meals, and people start talking, and there was probably laughter from time to time. And so the meal had gone on for a while, so that means there had already been a blessing and such. And so it was probably 20, 30 minutes into the meal, and all of a sudden, Jesus stood up. Everybody was crying. He stood up, he went over and got a bowl, and he poured water in the bowl, and he started washing the disciples' feet. What? Now, washing feet was the most menial task in those days. They got women to do it. That tells you how menial it was. Or the lowest servant in the whole household. But it seems that there was no servant in the household that night. And the disciples were not going to volunteer to wash each other's feet because, well, let's just say it may have been like it was in the other Gospels, where the disciples were arguing about who was the greatest, and nobody was going to want to start washing feet. So Jesus, seeing that they were propped up with their dirty feet hanging out, and nobody had washed them, got up, and he poured water in a bowl, and he started asking them to put their feet in the bowl. And then he would take another pitcher of water, and he would pour it over their feet until their feet were really, really wet. And he would work on their feet to get the mud out of, the bottoms of the feet and between the toes. And then he would take a towel and he would wipe their feet until their feet were completely dry. It's wonderful to have something like that done to your feet by somebody else besides yourselves, yes. And he did that for all 12 disciples. It probably took quite a while. And it certainly was one of the more shocking things that he had done with his disciples. Well, there was a little bit of struggle about it. Jesus carrying a towel. Now, remember, this is Reign of Christ Sunday. Jesus is not supposed to be picking up a towel. He's supposed to be the king. But here he is. He's picking up a towel. You know what we use towels for? We dry the dishes. We wipe up tables. We wash out wounds. We swaddle children. We wipe up babies. Yeah, that's what we do with a towel. Towels are not a symbol of power. Each one of us, when we were babies, volunteered to allow some person who loved us to wipe us clean. And we may do that again someday as we get older or if we become very ill. That's what a towel is for. Jesus picked up a towel. Peter, on the other hand, you know Peter's reputation, protested. "You will never wash my feet," he said. Jesus says, "If I don't wash your feet, then you will not be part of me." And notice that Jesus went ahead and washed Peter's feet, but he washed Judas's feet. He knew that Judas was going to betray him. Fact of the matter is, Jesus probably even knew they were all going to run away from him when he needed them the very most, and he still washed their feet that night. Every one of them. I'm beginning to think that there is not a single person on this planet that Jesus wouldn't wash. I mean, if he would wash the disciples' feet the night before he died, I'm sure he would wash our feet too. That's just the way Jesus was. You know, I never told Bob what really happened the night I went and visited him when he was in a coma. I knew he wouldn't understand it, and I didn't understand it either, just like the disciples didn't understand what Jesus was doing with them when he washed their feet. I never told Bob that I came in and I was full of despair and anger. I never told him I cried and got his hand all wet, and I never told him that I had wiped his hand, and that I was so ashamed of being so emotional and had taken this towel and wiped my face that by the time it was dark, which is when I left, I skulked out of the ICU trying to make sure nobody saw me with my red face. I never told any of that to Bob. Which is just as well, because it turns out that Bob had something to teach me, just like Jesus had something to teach his disciples the night that he washed their feet. Bob taught me that there is more to prayer than just a victory or a crown. More to it than that. He taught me that out of despair and darkness, towels and tears, new life can happen. That's right. New life. That's in fact where it comes from. Bob lived a number of years after this incident, but the thing that he never forgot was the fact that he had that feeling, that experience of God in his heart. It completely changed his life. And he would tell about it to me from time to time, and it makes me remember, I guess, that we are called by Jesus to do the same thing that he did for his disciples. We are called to wash the wounds of our weary world in his name. And when we do that, that's when we begin to understand what this is all about. That is when we start to understand that what we need isn't someone who wears a crown. What we need is someone who has a towel. That's what we've always needed. And that is what we still need. And we can do this for one another. And the more we help out others in this way, the more we will begin to experience that new life. Bob felt all the rest of his years that new life after that day. And after he told me his story, I felt it too. And I still do.